Cut the feed, or the scouts will trace it back to us. The barked command echoed through the cavern as sparks rained from a half-sealed conduit, the harsh tang of burned polymer filling the air. Men and women moved fast along the scaffold, their boots clanging against the grated platforms, their gloves leaving smears of grease across panels carved into the hollow of a mined asteroid. Heat shimmered from an overloaded torch, sweat pooled under helmets, and every sense screamed of urgency, as if survival itself balanced on this single adjustment. Commander Rin Vaynar leaned over the rail, his eyes fixed on the laser plasma display mounted against the stone wall, the blue-green lines pulsing with Dominion patrol vectors. He lifted his wrist to check the heads-up display projected against his visor, then turned back toward the frantic crew with a voice meant to cut through the noise. Every second we waste makes us louder than we can afford. Finish the seal, vent the line into the mantle, and make this vault invisible again. The chamber stank of scorched insulation and sharp dust from fractured rock. Sparks bit into the fabric of coveralls, forcing workers to flinch as they soldered new connectors. The clang of tools against steel supports reverberated like war drums, each strike reminding them that they had no margin for error. Rin descended the ladder to the deck, his boots slamming down on the grating. He walked straight toward the repair chief, an older man with lines carved deep into his face, hands steady despite the chaos. "You told me we'd be dark before the shift," Rin said, low and sharp. The chief met his gaze, eyes ringed red from exhaustion. The casing fractured deeper than scans showed. "I'll finish it, but I won't promise miracles." Rin's reply was cold, almost cruel in its directness. "Miracles are what die when someone lies about numbers. Get it done, or we don't live long enough to complain." The cavern shook as a heavy panel snapped into place, releasing a dull vibration through the rock. Fine dust drifted from the ceiling, coating shoulders and helmets. One worker coughed, the taste of grit clinging to her tongue, and pressed on with tightening bolts, sweat sliding into her eyes. Rin stepped back, taking in the entire chamber, cables stretched like veins across the walls, coolant ducts snaking into tunnels that plunged deep toward the planet's frozen crust, scaffolds creaking under the strain of bodies, hauling sheets of armor toward the hull taking shape at the center. The unfinished warship, the Obsidian Crown, dominated the chamber. Its dark skin absorbed every shaft of light thrown across it, a vessel carved to vanish even while being born. Crews slid along its flanks, fixing plates into place with magnetic clamps, their movements timed and disciplined. The air reeked of hot sealant and the sharp tang of coolant vapor leaking from temporary lines. Rin's hand brushed against the inside of his coat, where tags rested heavy against his ribs. Each tag bore a name etched into thin alloy, the record of a comrade who had fallen during Earth's final hours. He carried them always, not for ritual, but as debt. The weight grounded him, pressing memory into every order he gave. His headset chimed, and he accepted the link. A crisp voice came through, belonging to Hadron, operations officer and one of the few veterans older than Rin. "We caught the Dominion scouts drifting near Sirius Gate," Hadron reported, his words even, his tone sharpened by decades of hiding. "Telemetry shows they lingered too long. When they broke formation, fragments scattered across the lane. Impact signatures are ours." Rin's eyes narrowed, his mind assembling the chain of cause and effect. The Comet mines had worked. Dominion analysts would find shards scored by tungsten strikes, the kind of impact pattern their weapons never produced. The trap had sprung, quiet and absolute. "Good," Rin said, his voice steady. "They'll dismiss it as raiders, but doubt has already taken root. That doubt is worth more than the wreckage." He turned and studied the crown again, the vessel that would one day cut through Dominion formations like a blade. Around him the workers pressed harder, their hands raw beneath gloves, the throb of power tools shaking their bones. One young technician slipped on a wet patch of coolant, his helmet slamming against the deck. He groaned, dazed as blood streaked across his cheek. Rin crouched, lifted him with a grip that was firm but not unkind, and pressed a rag into his palm. "Get up. You bleed later. Right now, you keep this ship alive." The boy swallowed hard, wiped his face, and returned to work, shame and resolve burning through his exhaustion. The air thickened with the scent of heated alloys and scorched lubricant. Every breath carried the taste of stone dust and recycled moisture, a reminder that the chamber itself was their camouflage. Above, the control gallery displayed the system's gravitic map in luminous relief, points of light marking Dominion patrol routes. Officers studied the shifting lines, murmuring terse updates, their fingers running over controls with rehearsed efficiency. Jan from Signals called down to Rin. Patrol cadence unchanged. They'll sweep the gate again in 24 hours. We'll have to keep feeding them noise to hold their suspicion in place. Rin tilted his head, calculating. Then bleed the next packet through the neutrino drip. Keep it indistinguishable from stellar background. If they tug again, I want them chasing shadows until their doctrine betrays them. Dust crunched underfoot as Rin walked back to the scaffold, the sound sharp in the cavern's strained silence. He climbed until he could rest his hand on the unfinished spine of the crown, the metal cold beneath his glove, the seam vibrating faintly from internal stress tests. His council gathered below, faces lit by the glow of the displays. Hadrian looked up and asked, "When do we show them what we've built?" Rin's eyes never left the hull. "Not yet. Silence is our greatest weapon. When they finally see us, it will be at a time of our choosing, in a place that tears the heart from their command." His voice carried, and every worker, every officer, every tech paused for the briefest moment, hearing the weight of the words. Then the chamber returned to motion, tools sparking, clamps locking, men and women grinding through fatigue because silence could not build itself. Hours later, as the shift changed, Rin stood alone on the highest catwalk, watching steam curl from cooling ducts, listening to the scrape of boots below, feeling the grit of stone settle on his skin. He remembered Earth's final image, the sky ripped open, cities erased in blinding fire, oceans torn into steam. That memory was not despair, it was instruction. They had been erased once, and that erasure was now their camouflage. He whispered to the hull, almost reverently, "When we return, it won't be as survivors. It will be as executioners of debts long owed. Light discipline, all of you. Kill those torches now." Hadrian's roar shook the cavernous dock, snapping exhausted workers out of their rhythm. Sparks cascaded from one of the scaffolds where a plate had been misaligned and had to be resealed. But the sound carried too far, and the glow risked leaking into the monitoring path of a Dominion probe sweeping a nearby sector. Tools were dropped, panels clattered, and in an instant the vault fell into uneasy darkness, broken only by the flicker of emergency strips mounted against the stone walls. The sudden silence pressed against eardrums, heavy as men and women caught their breath and felt the grit of stone dust cling to their damp skin. Commander Rin Vaynar moved among them, the shadows sharpening the severe angles of his face. His boots grated across the deck as he stopped beside the guilty welder, a young recruit barely 20 cycles old, still trembling as he lowered his tool. Rin didn't shout. He leaned close, his voice deliberate, low and sharp as a blade. "Every spark you shed is a beacon. Every sound you make feeds their suspicion. Forget comfort, forget haste. Discipline is the only armor we own." The boy's throat bobbed as he swallowed, nodding fast, his gloved hands still shaking. Rin straightened, turned toward the crews above, and gestured for work to resume in silence. This time the panels slid into place with measured steadiness. Bolts tightened with dampened torque wrenches, and every movement became a rehearsal for survival. He climbed the ladder to the upper gallery, the smell of hot sealant still lingering faintly in the stale air. The command deck was cut directly into the rock, its walls lined with stripped wiring and makeshift cooling ducts. At the center stood the laser plasma display, projecting the sector's gravitic map in wavering layers of light. Dominion patrol paths traced like scars across the screen, glowing red markers showing the last disappearance near Sirius. Ilian from Signals leaned over the console, her fingers dancing across input keys with an intensity that betrayed both fatigue and urgency. "We've intercepted another burst," she said, eyes locked on the streams of data spilling across her visor. "Encrypted, too structured for civilian chatter. They're feeding home the losses, Commander. They're writing theories already." Rin's jaw tightened. He felt the weight of memory pull at him, the echo of earth burning still embedded in the fabric of his thoughts. Yet he answered without hesitation. Then let them speculate. They will drown themselves in possibilities while we shape certainty. Feed them another packet of noise. Drip it into their channels until they mistrust their own shadows. Hadrian crossed his arms, gaze locked on the screen. If we keep baiting them like this, we'll invite a heavier sweep. They'll come with warships, not scouts. Rin turned, his expression hard. Then we teach them the difference between searching and surviving. Our silence is not weakness. It is a weapon. Every move they make to confirm our death binds them tighter to the lie they wrote themselves. The chamber thrummed faintly with the vibration of coolant cycling deep into the crust below, bleeding their heat into stone. Workers above shifted back into rhythm, their gloves sliding over cold plates, drills biting into hardened alloy. The sharp bite of metal filings filled the air, mixed with the recycled tang of stale water mist venting from the ducts. Rin's senses recorded everything: the sting of grit in his eyes, the rattle of distant scaffolds, the raw rasp of strained breathing from crews who had forgotten what rest felt like. Every detail carried meaning. The doctrine demanded awareness. Nothing wasted, nothing ignored. Later in the council chamber, a narrow cavern lined with rough benches and dim lights, the senior officers gathered. Their faces carried exhaustion, but also the iron steadiness of men and women who had survived the unthinkable and refused to yield. Rin stood at the head, leaning against a scarred table marked with decades of calculations and hastily carved notes. He began without preamble. You've all seen the telemetry. The mine struck clean. The scouts are gone. The Dominion will not admit doubt yet, but the seed has been planted. Hadrian rested heavy hands on the bench. Seeds take water. Doubt dries fast if it isn't fed. Rin met his gaze. That's why we bleed it into them, drop by drop. We teach them that every corridor is unsafe, every map corrupted, every reading compromised. That paranoia will cost them more than any single strike. Tor, master of logistics, spoke next, his voice gravelly, the sound of a man who had worked too long among dust and scarcity. Our stockpiles are thinning. Salvage can only stretch so far. If we keep running traps, we'll burn through supplies meant to last the year. Rin nodded, acknowledging the truth without flinching. Then we steal from them directly. We raid their convoys, strip their depots, twist their own supply lines into our veins. Every deficit we carry becomes another weakness they expose. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the distant clatter of construction echoing through the rock. Ilian pushed her visor back, eyes red-rimmed, hair damp with sweat. If the Dominion realizes we're not raiders but survivors, they'll come with fleets, not patrols. They'll scour every rogue world, burn every comet tail. Rin's answer came like a strike. And when they do, we'll show them silence made us sharper. If they want to scour shadows, they will lose themselves in the dark. His voice carried a weight that pressed into every chest, not through volume but through conviction. The officers bowed their heads slightly. The discussion concluded not by decree but by shared understanding. When the council dispersed, Rin lingered, his hands pressed against the scarred table. He remembered the last order Earth ever gave, the order to scatter, to vanish, to live only in rumor. He could still hear the crackle of the broadcast as ships broke orbit, his own carrier diving into the cold, with reactors throttled low, heat bled into ice, silence becoming their only companion. He clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms, then released the tension with a controlled breath. Extinction was their story, he whispered to himself, words carried into the stone walls. Survival will be ours. Hours later, he walked the scaffolds alone, the clang of his boots echoing against the hull of the obsidian crown. Workers had collapsed against tool benches, their bodies heavy with exhaustion, the air filled with the pungent mix of sweat, coolant vapor, and heated alloys. He paused beside a young mechanic slumped against a crate, her hand still gripping a wrench even in sleep. He draped a thermal sheet over her shoulders without a word, then turned back toward the hull, laying a hand against the cold skin of the unfinished ship. The surface was rough beneath his glove, still pitted from incomplete assembly, but it thrummed faintly with the heartbeat of a vessel not yet born. A comms chime pulsed against his visor. Illian's voice came through, weary but steady. Dominion relay buoy just activated. They're diverting patrols towards Sirius. We've bought their attention. Rin's lips curved into a thin, grim smile. Good. Let them come. Every step they take into the dark brings them closer to what we've prepared. He closed the channel, the silence of the cavern wrapping around him again. Dust settled slowly through the air, the taste of stone dry on his tongue. Above, the dim lights flickered, casting the ship in fractured shadows that made it look less like a vessel, and more like a predator crouching, waiting. Rin stayed there for a long while, listening to the quiet labor of those still awake, feeling the cold seep through his gloves, smelling the burnt tang of the tools that had not yet cooled. All of it was real, and all of it mattered. Silence had become not just a tactic, but the marrow of their survival, and every day they endured under it, the stronger their strike would be when the galaxy finally learned they had never been erased. Signal confirmed. They're alive inside Procyon. Illian's words cut through the chamber like a blade. The officers gathered around the laser plasma display leaned closer, the faint glow washing across tired faces, their shadows stretching against the carved stone walls. For a moment the air seemed to thicken, every man and woman straining to absorb the meaning hidden in those lines of intercepted data. Commander Rin Vaynar stood at the table's edge, his fingers pressed against its scarred surface. He let the silence hold, forcing the officers to feel the weight of what had just been spoken. Sleeper agents, descendants of the first scattering, were not myth anymore. They had endured within Dominion territory, buried under false identities, working in shipyards and depots as shadows wearing borrowed names. And now, against every calculation, their coded bursts had slipped through the Dominion filters, disguised as stellar background noise, reaching the Black Fleet after generations of silence. Hadron broke first, his gravel voice carrying across the room. If they've lasted this long inside the forge, they're more than survivors. They're architects. We can't squander that. His hands curled into fists against the bench. Tor, keeper of dwindling supplies, shifted uneasily, the straps of his harness creaking. If we move too soon, we drain ourselves dry. A strike at Procyon would demand resources we can barely replace. Rin lifted his gaze, his eyes fixed on the glowing map of Dominion holdings. His tone carried no fire, only certainty sharpened by years of calculation. The forge is more than steel and reactors. It is their pride, their artery, the monument to their belief that we no longer exist. If we cripple it, we don't just cut their supply lines, we unmake their confidence. The sleeper cells have prepared the ground for centuries. We honor their endurance by answering when they call. The chamber held its breath. Dust drifted down from the rock ceiling, faintly visible in the glow of the display. Sweat traced down faces as the officers weighed the command. Illian adjusted her visor, eyes burning with fatigue but voice unwavering. They've given us schedules, patrol rotations, blind windows during flare cycles. Everything fits. They've risked generations for this opening. Tor slammed a palm against the bench. Generations, yes, but if we fail, they'll be slaughtered, and we'll lose the only advantage exile ever gave us. Silence dies the moment we reveal our hand. His words cracked with anger, not out of cowardice but desperation, born of endless scarcity. Rin stepped forward, the tags beneath his coat pressing cold against his ribs. He let his voice rise, not in volume, but in force. Silence was never a tomb. It was a blade waiting for the moment to strike. If we hide forever, extinction will finish what the Dominion began. Our children will inherit nothing but fear. We strike because it is the only way to give them more than a rumor. The officers looked at him, and in their expressions flickered something beyond calculation. Resolve built on debt, on memory, on hunger for justice. Hadron gave a slow nod, heavy as stone. Then we move, but the doctrine remains. Every action must bleed into the next. No wasted motion, no desperate charge. We shape them step by step until they no longer trust the ground they stand on. The council dispersed into the tunnels, their boots grinding across the gritty floor. The air smelled of sweat and dust. the taste of recycled moisture heavy on the tongue. Rin lingered, watching the glowing display fade into standby. Alone, he whispered into the quiet, "They thought you erased us. Instead, you taught us how to vanish." Later in the docking vault, crews prepared interceptors for a raid against Dominion convoys. Sparks leapt from cutters, the sharp bite of heated alloy carrying through the chamber. Men shouted over the din, their voices hoarse, their gloves streaked with grease. A young pilot tightened straps across her chest and glanced up at Rin as he approached. Her face was pale, her eyes wide but unblinking. "Sir, what if they catch us before we even reach the lanes?" Rin crouched until his gaze locked with hers. His reply was steady, carrying the weight of a promise. "Then you die knowing your run carved space for those behind you. Fear won't keep us alive. Only purpose does." The pilot's throat tightened, but she nodded, her jaw set as she climbed into the cockpit. The canopy sealed with a dull thud, muffling her face behind the sheen of reinforced glass. The interceptors launched in silence, rails propelling them like arrows into the cold beyond. Workers and officers alike stood watching from the gallery, the vibrations under their feet fading as the ships vanished into the dark. Dust and heat clung to the chamber, but beneath it all lingered a charge, a recognition that silence was ending. Hours later, reports trickled back. Dominion convoys had been struck at weak points, cargo stripped, escorts thrown into confusion. The raiders did not linger. They scattered like sparks, vanishing into prepared vectors, leaving behind wreckage marked by the same unmistakable kinetic scoring that had unsettled the Dominion scouts at Sirius. Rin listened to each report, his hand tightening against the rail as confirmation mounted. The Black Fleet was no longer rumor. It was shaping itself into memory, one raid at a time. In a small chamber off the main dock, Rin sat alone with the first intercepted message from the Procyon sleepers. The words were stripped, coded, reduced to bare phrases. "We endure. We wait for the flare. We are ready." His throat tightened as he traced the letters, the weight of centuries pressing down. He could almost hear the voices of those hidden generations, men and women who had swallowed their names and lived as ghosts, all so that this moment might come. Hadrian entered quietly, carrying a flask of recycled water. He set it on the bench and leaned against the wall, his posture weary, but his eyes sharp. "You carry it all too heavily," he muttered. "If you break under it, the fleet breaks with you." Rin looked up, exhaustion etched deep in his features, and answered simply, "I carry it because they cannot. If I falter, every sacrifice that brought us here becomes wasted. I won't let that ledger close unfinished." Hadrian exhaled slowly, the sound rough, like stone grinding against stone. "Then you'd better be ready when the flare comes, because once we move on Procyon, there's no hiding left." Rin stared at the coded message one last time, then folded it carefully and slid it into his jacket beside the tags. The taste of dust still coated his tongue. The air was thick with heat, and the low scrape of workers finishing the crown's armor echoed down the tunnels. He rose, squared his shoulders, and gave his final words with quiet certainty. "Silence carried us here. Strike will carry us forward. Shields down in 3 minutes. If we miss this window, we lose the forge forever." Illian's voice cracked through the command channel, and every officer in the gallery snapped to attention. The air tasted of copper and recycled water, sweat dripping down collars as tension spread across the chamber. On the main deck of the Obsidian Crown, boots struck against the grated flooring in urgent rhythm, the scent of heated alloy and lubricants clinging to every surface. Men strapped into harnesses, their faces pale under the glow of the laser plasma displays, eyes darting between readouts that pulsed with Dominion patrol patterns and the incoming stellar flare. Commander Rin Vaynar stood on the raised platform, his shoulders square, his hands gripping the rail until his knuckles whitened. The flare had begun to rise, its radiation pulsing in waves that battered sensors across the sector. Dominion outposts were blind, their surveillance reduced to static and corrupted noise. It was the moment the sleeper cells had waited centuries for, and hesitation now would erase their sacrifice. Rin's voice carried across the chamber with cold force. "Every strike we deliver today will echo across their empire. Fail, and we vanish again as ghosts. Succeed, and we tear their confidence from its root. There is no other path." Below him, torpedo crews wheeled massive tungsten rods into their launch racks, the scrape of steel against steel echoing like thunder in the confined dock. Sparks from power couplings danced across the air as hands worked fast to lock each warhead in place. The smell of hot carbon and welding arcs filled lungs until men coughed against the thickness of the air. Hadrian's gravelly voice cut through the chaos, his arms folded as he paced along the crew. "Keep those seals tight. If one misfires, we burn with it." His words bit like iron, and the crews stiffened, finishing their work with grim determination. On the laser plasma display, the Procyon system swam into view. The forge dominated the center, a sprawling lattice of docking arms, refineries, and reactor cores glowing faintly against the background radiation. Dominion freighters clustered like insects around the perimeter, their escorts weaving lazy patterns, blind to the storm rising around them. Signals from the sleeper cells flickered into alignment, green icons glowing along weak points, sabotage coolant valves, fuel lines primed to ignite, control decks rigged to fail. Centuries of preparation had reduced the forge's fortress walls to paper, and now the Black Fleet would set it aflame. Rin keyed the channel. "Launch the freighters!" His words rolled like judgment, and across the vault, disguised haulers disengaged from their hiding places. For years they had drifted as wrecks, camouflaged under layers of frozen stone and dust. Now panels fell away, revealing launch rails and folded bays crammed with kinetic drivers. The ships lit with sudden purpose, drives glowing as they accelerated toward the forge. From the galleries of the Crown, crews held their breath, their mouths dry, their stomachs twisted in anticipation as they watched their long dormant weapons leap into motion. Inside the forge, the sleeper cells struck. At a coolant chamber, workers long thought broken by servitude revealed hidden blades and tools, slicing through pipes that hissed scalding steam. The air filled with the stench of burning oil as pressure surged unchecked. On the fuel lines, hidden charges detonated with deafening blasts, rattling steel corridors, and showering sparks across screaming workers. In the command decks, infiltrators triggered overloads, screens flashing warnings that drowned officers in a tide of false readings. Panic spread like wildfire, voices colliding in frantic shouts as Dominion guards drew weapons too late. Generations of silent endurance erupted in a single night of sabotage, and the forge trembled from within. On the Crown, Ilian counted down. "Targets exposed, trajectories clear." Rin raised his hand, then dropped it with finality. "Fire!" The tungsten rods launched in unison, the recoil shuddering through the ship, rattling teeth and bones. Crew members gritted their jaws as vibrations ran through the deck, the taste of iron sharp in their mouths from clenched blood vessels. The rods streaked across the void, invisible until they slammed into the forge, with earth-shattering force. Explosions tore through docking arms, shredding freighters like paper, rupturing reactors that belched fire and plasma across the station's frame. The light was blinding, searing retinas, forcing crews to squint against the brilliance. "Direct hits!" shouted a weapons officer, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Cores are breaching!" On the display, the forge lit up in cascading blossoms of orange and white, entire sectors collapsing inward as their structures buckled. Dominion escorts broke formation, their panic feeding chaos as wreckage hammered into their hulls. Fire roared through the system, spreading faster than any countermeasure could contain. The air aboard the Crown filled with the acrid bite of overheated systems, ozone from fried circuits, stinging eyes as officers scrambled to maintain power flow. Hadrian leaned over the rail, his voice a snarl. "We've done it. They'll choke on this for generations." Yet his triumph was tempered with grief, for he knew sleeper cells were burning inside, men and women who had given their lives to open the gates for this moment. Rin closed his eyes for a heartbeat, the tags at his chest pressing heavy as stone. He spoke softly but firmly, loud enough for the bridge. "Mark every one of them in the ledger. Their names will not be ash." As the light from the forge spread, Dominion reinforcements scrambled from nearby outposts, but the flare still blinded their sensors. Confused, panicked, unable to track targets, they floundered against phantoms. The Crown and her escorts slid back into the dark, cooling systems, bleeding heat into frozen rock, their trails indistinguishable from drifting debris. The crews exhaled as one, the silence after fire more deafening than the blasts themselves. Fingers unclenched from rails, jaws relaxed, and men collapsed into seats with trembling limbs. Ilian turned toward Rin, her voice unsteady, her throat raw. The survivors broadcast one last signal before the collapse. They showed the station burning, then fixed the camera on your insignia. Every Dominion channel will see it. Rin's face remained stone, but his eyes flickered with fire. Then the lie of our extinction is dead. From this night forward, they know humanity endures. On the collapsing forge, Dominion survivors screamed into broken comms, their cries overlapping with alarms and the shriek of tearing metal. For them, the nightmare had only begun. For the Black Fleet, it was the first true breath in centuries. The air aboard the Crown still reeked of burned plastic, sweat, and fear, but beneath it lingered something new. Victory. Rin stepped down from the platform, walking the length of the command deck. He laid a hand against the cool rail, feeling its tremor subside as the ship stabilized. He looked at every face, their exhaustion written in pale skin, trembling hands and red-rimmed eyes. "You carried silence like a weapon," he said, voice deep and unyielding. "Now you've carried fire. Remember this moment. The galaxy will." Outside, the ruins of Procyon Forge glowed like a scar against the black, fragments of Dominion pride drifting endlessly. The Black Fleet slipped away, their silence restored, leaving behind a wound that would echo across empires. "They will answer with fire, Commander. Procyon cut too deep." Hadrian's voice rumbled across the dim council chamber, his fists pressed against the scarred table. The old officer's stare burning into Rin. The room still carried the sharp stench of sweat-soaked uniforms and scorched wiring from the forge strike, its stone walls echoing faintly with the vibrations of the Crown's drives cooling after the retreat. Officers gathered around the table, their faces haggard under the pale glow of the laser plasma display that painted Dominion space in shifting red patterns. Dust sifted from the ceiling as men and women leaned in, the taste of grit clinging to their lips. Rin didn't flinch. He watched the map with steady eyes, the Procyon system still glowing like a wound at its center. His reply was flat, stripped of triumph. "They cannot ignore it. Pride will drag them toward us. We use their anger as a leash." He let his hand rest on the table, feeling the carved grooves worn into the stone over years of desperate planning. Tor, arms folded, his face drawn by hunger and sleepless nights, snarled in frustration. "And when that leash pulls an armada down on us? You think discipline alone feeds mouths? We bled stockpiles for this strike. Rations are measured in crumbs. Supplies won't last a month if we're forced into open war." His words carried the bitterness of a man who had buried friends to starvation as often as to battle. Ilian, still raw from sleepless shifts at signals, cut in sharply. "They're already reconfiguring patrols. I intercepted orders rerouted across their relay net. It isn't scattered convoys anymore. They're massing fleets. Procyon wasn't just an injury, it was humiliation. They'll gather everything they can to crush the ghosts who wounded them." Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, but her gaze was unyielding. Hadrian's gravel voice returned, heavy with years of war. "That means we've got a heartbeat of time before the hammer falls. Once the Echelon Armada mobilizes, every hiding place becomes a grave. If we wait, they'll choke us out. If we move, we force them to fight on ground we choose." The chamber fell into silence, broken only by the scrape of a chair as Rin straightened to his full height. He looked at each of them in turn, Hadrian with his iron steadiness, Tor with his bitter pragmatism, Ilian with her restless urgency. His voice came quiet but carried through the room like a drawn blade. They built their empire on certainty, on the belief that resistance ends in extinction. At Procyon, that certainty cracked. Now they are terrified, and terror makes them predictable. They will come, and when they do, we will show them silence was never weakness. It was a weapon we forged into steel. Outside the council chamber, the docking vaults roared with activity. Crews rushed between scaffolds, the taste of coolant thick in the air as lines were flushed and refilled, the sharp bite of hot welds forcing eyes to water. Sparks leapt from fresh armor, plates being sealed onto smaller escorts. The ground shuddered with the weight of cargo sleds dragged across rails, loaded with ammunition stripped from Dominion convoys. Every corridor smelled of sweat and burning alloy, boots clattering against steel decks as men shouted orders, their throats raw from exhaustion. Rin walked among them, his boots echoing against the grated floor, dust clinging to his coat. A mechanic, his face streaked with grime, looked up as Rin passed, fear etched behind his exhausted eyes. "Sir, what if their fleets are too many?" The words hung fragile in the air, a whisper of doubt cutting through the clamor. Rin stopped, turned to him, and let the weight of his stare settle. His answer was steady, stripped of any pretense. "Then we bleed them until they doubt themselves more than we ever doubted our survival. That doubt will break them faster than numbers." The mechanic's jaw tightened, and he bent back to his work, hands steadier than before. Hours later, Dominion space convulsed with the ripple of commands. At their High Council chamber, alien delegates hissed and spat accusations, the memory of Procyon's burning frame haunting their pride. Admiral Korvath Jal, towering in his black armor, slammed his clawed hand onto the council dais, his guttural voice cutting through the chamber. "You declared them extinct. You paraded their ashes as victory, and now your arrogance has birthed ghosts that burn our stations. I will end this lie with steel and fire. The Echelon Armada will march, and every shadow will bleed out its human infestation." The chamber fell into sullen agreement, pride forcing unity where fear alone might not. The Black Fleet listened as intercepted transmissions carried Jal's threats across the dark. Ilion relayed them, her voice echoing through the Crown's bridge. The officers stood stiff, their faces hardening as the Dominion's fury spilled into their ears. Hadrian broke the silence with grim satisfaction. "There it is. He's gathering them for a decisive blow. Their doctrine demands it. That's the leash you wanted, Commander." Rin watched the display shift, red icons multiplying, Dominion fleets converging on the Vega corridor. His features were carved in stone, but inside he felt the cold weight of inevitability pressing against his ribs. "Then Vega becomes our anvil," he said at last. "We will not outrun them. We will not hide. We break their doctrine at its heart." The officers exchanged glances, none voicing the fear etched behind their hardened stares. Tor muttered, his voice so hoarse, "Breaking them costs ships we cannot rebuild." Rin's reply was merciless. "Then every ship dies buying something greater than silence. They die buying tomorrow." Across the fleet, the crews prepared. Rations were cut thinner, weapons loaded heavier. Men drilled in narrow corridors until their muscles ached, sweat dripping down backs, the sound of boots striking in unison echoing like thunder through the stone halls. The air was thick with the smell of burned lubricant and damp cloth. Hands blistered from hauling crates, ears ringing from the constant clang of tools against armor. And beneath it all ran a current of resolve, sharp as a blade, carried in whispered promises that the Dominion would never again believe humanity gone. Rin returned to his quarters that night, the chamber bare, save for the bench carved from stone and the tags laid out in careful rows. He sat, head bowed, the air heavy with the metallic tang of blood dried into fabric, the faint heat of the ship's veins pressing against the walls. His fingers traced each tag, remembering faces lost at Earth, comrades scattered in exile, agents who had burned themselves inside Procyon. His whisper was not prayer, but command. "You are the ledger. Tomorrow I write in your names again, but this time I will write their empire beside you." As he rose, alarms chimed faintly, signals blooming on the fleet's display systems. Ilion's tired voice carried through the comms. "Confirmation. The Echelon Armada is moving. Hundreds of ships converging at Vega." The words rolled through the Crown like a storm, men freezing in place, then moving faster, hearts pounding, sweat breaking cold across skin. Rin walked to the bridge, every step echoing across the grated floor, and stared at the red tide gathering on the display. He let the silence stretch, his officers watching, waiting for his answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried with the weight of generations. "Then the time has come. We show them what silence taught us. Load every mine and check their triggers twice. A single failure ruins the field. Hadrian's command echoed through the hangar as crews swarmed over the weapon sleds. Their shouts drowned beneath the grinding of chains and the hiss of coolant lines flooding chambers that would keep the charges cold. Sparks leapt from welding torches, the air thick with the sharp tang of scorched alloy and sweat. Boots pounded across the grated floor, and the clang of tools against casing filled the cavern with a rhythm like hammers forging judgment. Commander Rin Vinar strode among them, his coat streaked with dust from the tunnels. He paused beside a crate where two young loaders strained to slide a warhead onto its rail. Their arms shook, faces glistening under the heat of lamps bolted into the rock. "Keep your grip steady," Rin said, his voice sharp but steady, carrying enough weight to still their trembling. They heaved the missile into place, clamps snapping tight, and only then did he nod. "Good. That steadiness is what keeps you alive when the Armada arrives." At the edge of the vault, a makeshift command platform overlooked the activity. Ilian stood bent over the laser plasma display, its glow painting her tired features green and red. Lines of data sketched the Dominion's converging fleets, hundreds of ships coiling toward Vega. Her voice was hoarse when she called out, "They've shifted more carriers into the vanguard. Jal means to lead with weight." Sweat ran down her temple as she recalculated trajectories. "If we want the jammers to hold, we'll need overlapping fields." Tor, leaning against a supply crate, barked a bitter laugh. "Overlapping fields cost ships. We already gutted interceptors for the Crown's armor. What else do you want us to strip?" His words carried exhaustion edged with anger. He spat dust onto the stone floor and muttered, "Every trap we build eats another rib from our fleet. We're bleeding ourselves before we even meet them." Rin climbed the platform, the steel ladder rattling under his weight. He looked at Tor, then at the entire crew now glancing up from below. His voice was controlled, but every syllable landed with force. "Bleeding now means they bleed more later. Every mine we plant, every jammer we risk, every decoy we sacrifice buys us their confusion. Dominion doctrine cannot function without order. Break their order, and their numbers choke them." Hadrian slammed a fist onto the rail, his gravel tone grinding through the air. "Then Vega is the crucible. Every trap, every ounce of silence we forged, we burn it there. If we fail, nothing waits behind us but graves." The words landed heavy, yet no one turned away. Later in the signal chamber, the atmosphere pressed down with heat from overworked consoles. The recycled air smelled faintly of sweat-soaked fabric and overheated wiring. Ilian bent close to her display, the lines on her face deepening as she tuned the outbound jammers. Rin entered quietly, the scrape of his boots against stone drawing her attention. She straightened, weary but unyielding. "If they detect the interference too soon, they'll adapt. We have to stagger the pulses, make it look like their own systems are failing." Rin nodded, studying the green waves rolling across the screen. His hand rested briefly on her shoulder. "You've carried the silence longer than most. Can you hold it one more time?" She looked up, her eyes rimmed red from fatigue, and whispered, "If I falter, you tell them I never did." Rin's expression didn't shift, but the weight in his eyes acknowledged the cost. Out beyond the rogue planet, raiders launched into the void, their small craft gliding cold to scatter mines across the corridor to Vega. The sleds opened, dropping their deadly cargo disguised as frozen debris, each charge coated in rock dust to fool even the most careful scan. Pilots sat rigid in their harnesses, sweat running down spines as they whispered status reports into comms, voices tight with tension. Fingers clenched over triggers as they drifted silently past Dominion buoys, the taste of fear bitter on their tongues. Only when the last mine clicked into place and the sleds turned back did the crews exhale, air rattling in lungs held too long. Inside the Crown, the officers gathered in the gallery once more. The laser plasma display flickered with the Armada's march. Hundreds of red icons tightening formation, the Dominion's fury coiling into a spear aimed at Vega. Dust hung in the air, the tang of burned circuitry still clinging after the forge battle. Hadrian leaned forward, his scarred knuckles pressed against the rail. "They'll bring everything to crush us. That's our strength. One target, one battlefield. We bleed them where we choose." Tor scowled, his voice raw. And if bleeding them bleeds us dry? Rin met his gaze, eyes unwavering. Then we die teaching them silence has teeth. Either way, extinction ends as their lie, not ours. The room fell still, every officer understanding the bargain. Beyond the chamber, welders worked until their arms gave out, the clang of hammers carrying down stone halls. The air was thick with dust and exhaustion, but beneath it all throbbed a current of defiance. They were no longer hiding. They were drawing the monster toward the knife they had built. That night, Rin walked the outer galleries alone. The cavern floor trembled faintly under the weight of cargo sleds, the distant clang of chains echoing like drums. He leaned against the cold rail, watching sparks arc from scaffolds, the sharp scent of heated alloy scratching his throat. His eyes lifted to the darkness beyond the vault mouth, where Vega waited like a storm on the horizon. He whispered into the silence, voice low, caring only for himself. You come with your fleets, Jal, and you will learn what silence carved into us. When he turned back, the crews were still working, hands blistered, lungs burning, eyes bloodshot, but none slowed. They had become the doctrine itself. Endurance turned to weapon, exile reshaped into fire. Vega would be the place it all broke, either the Dominion's pride or humanity's last refuge. Contact at bearing 12, frontline carriers breaking through the minefield. The shout tore through the obsidian crown's bridge, snapping every officer into motion. Red light washed over the command gallery, sweat glistening on strained faces as alarms bled urgency into the stale hot air. The laser plasma display rippled with red icons pouring across the Vega corridor, the Dominion's armada surging through like a tidal wave. Each mark was a warship, each warship carrying enough firepower to erase cities. And yet they pushed forward blind, their formations already fractured by jammers that had turned orders into looping static. Rin Vaynar stood at the center rail, boots locked, against the trembling deck as another Dominion cruiser detonated in the distance, its hull ripped apart by a drifting mine. He smelled burning insulation from an overloaded console and felt the vibration of impact shudder up through his spine. His voice cut through the chaos, steady and unyielding. Hold the formation. Every ship is bait. Keep them chasing cohesion they cannot find. On the starboard flank, interceptors darted like knives, launching kinetic rods that punched through the ribs of frigates before scattering into debris. The flash of explosions painted the crew's visors in blinding white, the taste of ash and iron filling mouths as the Crown's hull shook from the shockwaves. A young weapons officer cried out as sparks seared his arm, the acrid bite of burnt cloth rising into the recycled air. He gritted his teeth, forced his shaking hand back onto the firing grip, and barked, "Load the next volley." Dominion discipline held only briefly. Cut off from clear command, their squadrons collided, desperate captains ramming through their own escorts in an attempt to rejoin fractured lines. Over open comms, alien voices snarled in broken transmissions, curses dissolving into static as Black Fleet jammers twisted their channels. One enemy commander screamed orders that overlapped endlessly in recursive feedback, the distorted sound spilling across the bridge and sending shivers down the crew's backs. Hadron leaned close to Rin, his scarred face lit by the flicker of collapsing Dominion icons. His gravel voice ground out through clenched teeth. We've gutted their flanks, but their core remains untouched. If they regroup, we're crushed. His words were not fear. They were fact. Rin's reply was ice. Then we drive through their heart before it beats again. He keyed the channel and his voice thundered across the fleet. All surviving craft, Titan formation on the Crown. We strike the command vessel. Every hull, every hand, every life bends to this thrust. The crews obeyed without hesitation. Wrecked interceptors veered back. Pickets carved trails through debris, and battered escorts fell into formation. The Crown's main drives roared to full burn, the vibration rattling teeth and bones as the flagship surged forward. The deck lurched beneath boots, and officers clung to rails, the taste of copper biting tongues as acceleration pressed bodies against harnesses. Sparks rained from overworked conduits, the heat thick enough to sting throats, but no one faltered. On the laser plasma display, the Dominion command ship loomed, a fortress at the Armada's core, surrounded by staggering escorts. Its silhouette burned red across the map, the symbol of the Dominion's unbroken pride. Around it, alien captains struggled to form a defensive shell, their voices shrill over broken channels. But coordination was already lost. Ilian's voice cracked as she called over the bridge. Jammers holding, but systems are overheating. If we push them further, signals collapse for us as well. Sweat rolled down her temples, her fingers trembling as they flew across the console. Rin's gaze never left the glowing mark of the command vessel, then collapsed with them, so long as they drowned first. The Crown drove into the storm. Kinetic fire from escorts hammered against her armor, the deck shaking violently as sparks exploded from ruptured panels. The air filled with the stench of scorched wiring, the crash of falling tools, the screams of injured crew. A medic hauled a bleeding technician from beneath a collapsed console, the taste of iron filling the air as blood pooled across the deck. Still, the ship surged forward, her dark hull absorbing punishment, her crew forcing her alive with sweat and will. Hadron slammed a fist against the console, snarling, "If we don't break through in the next minute, we die pinned here." Rin's voice came like a blade through the noise. "Then we don't wait a minute." He opened the command channel. "All interceptors, strike their escorts head on. Ram if you must. Carve us a path." The order was carried with no hesitation. Interceptors flung themselves into Dominion ships, the shock of impact visible as blinding bursts across the display. Pilots screamed their final words into the comms before their voices cut into silence. But every sacrifice widened the breach. Escorts staggered, their formation breaking, and through the shattered line the Crown surged. The Dominion command vessel filled the forward view. Its armor glowed with the reflection of burning wreckage, its docking bays vomiting desperate fighters into the fray. The bridge shook as enemy fire slammed into the Crown's flanks, panels tearing free, alarms wailing in every corridor. Rin's hand tightened around the rail until blood drained from his knuckles. He shouted across the deck, his voice rising above the chaos. "All power to the drives! We break them here!" The crew obeyed with a fury born of centuries of silence. The Crown's engines roared, the vibration rattling teeth, forcing every man and woman to grit against the weight pressing them into their harnesses. Heat scorched skin, sweat poured, sparks burned through uniforms, but the flagship drove forward like a spear. The Dominion vessel loomed closer, its weapons firing desperately, but its escorts were shattered, its comms a storm of confusion. Hadrian's eyes burned with savage resolve as he leaned toward Rin. "We ram her spine. Nothing less will end this." Rin met his gaze, and in that instant, the weight of centuries bore down on them both. He gave the order with iron certainty. "Full burn, impact vector locked, detonate the package at entry." The Crown slammed into the Dominion command vessel with earth-shaking violence. The deck heaved, bodies thrown against harnesses, ribs cracking, teeth breaking. The roar of metal tearing apart filled ears, the air choking with smoke and dust. In that chaos, deep within the Dominion flagship, the Crown's kinetic package armed and fired. The explosion tore the command vessel apart from within, fire ripping through decks, turning the fortress into a collapsing carcass of flame and shattered steel. The shock wave rolled across the battlefield, Dominion formations breaking into chaos as their core disintegrated. On the bridge of the Crown, men gasped against smoke, their skin burned, their eyes watering, but the sight of the command ship dying seared itself into their minds forever. Ilian coughed, blood streaking her lips, and whispered, "They're scattering. Their spine is broken." Rin stood amid the wreckage of his bridge, his coat torn, his hands blackened with soot. He looked at the collapsing vessel on the display and spoke with cold finality. "Then the Armada falls with it." "Status of the Armada?" Rin's voice was raw, torn from hours of smoke and fire, but it carried across the ruined bridge with an authority that refused to break. Ilian wiped blood from her mouth, her fingers trembling as she clutched the console. "Their core is gone. Escorts are scattering, convoys pulling back. Signals are fractured beyond recovery. Vega is ours." Her throat tightened as she forced the words out, the exhaustion behind them heavy. The deck still shook beneath their boots, Shrapnel clattered loose from overhead panels, and the taste of ash filled every breath. Men coughed into their sleeves, their uniforms scorched, their hands blistered from hauling cables and bodies alike. The air stank of burned wiring and sweat, every breath thick. But through that ruin burned a sense of finality. Centuries of silence had ended with fire. Hadrian leaned against the rail, his body sagging but his voice steady. We broke them here. The Armada will never reform as it was. Their fleets are bleeding out in confusion. His eyes, reddened by smoke, searched Rin's face for confirmation. Rin looked past him, through the shattered viewport where the Dominion command vessel still drifted in pieces, glowing embers scattering across Vega's stars. His reply was quiet but unyielding. We didn't just break their fleets. We broke their certainty. They thought we were gone. Now they know we endured. Around them, crews worked in silence. Medics lifted the wounded onto stretchers, the smell of blood mingling with the charred sting of scorched circuits. Sparks hissed as engineers forced failing systems back into compliance, sweat streaking their soot-stained faces. Every movement carried the weight of exhaustion, but no one faltered. They had carried silence for generations. Tonight they carried victory. Tor entered the bridge, his face pale beneath grime, his voice a hoarse rasp. Stores are near empty, hull damage across half the escorts. If the Dominion launches another wave, we cannot hold. His eyes flickered to the viewport, watching the last Dominion cruisers limping into retreat. But I don't think they will. Not soon. Rin's gaze turned sharp. Why? Tor exhaled hard, leaning on the bulkhead for support. Because their command structure is shattered. They don't know who gives the orders anymore. Every captain fights for his own survival. Fear is louder than command. Ilian forced herself upright, blood still trickling down her chin. Then that fear becomes the corridor we carve. Not for planets, not for conquest, for sovereignty. We hold what no fleet can take, uncertainty itself. Rin studied the faces around him. Hadrian, bloodied but steady. Tor, worn but unbroken. Ilian, trembling but unyielding. He let the silence linger before speaking. Then we make it law. From this moment forward, humanity claims corridors, not thrones. We don't rebuild Earth into a fortress. We leave it as it stands, ashes as evidence, silence as warning. Every empire that looks at that ruin will know what extinction forged. The words carried through the crew, reaching ears strained by battle, hearts bruised by sacrifice. Men lifted their heads, women straightened their backs, wounded clenched their teeth, and all understood that this victory was not the end of survival, it was its codification. In Dominion space, the ripples spread fast. Colonized species, once cowed by the Dominion's iron hand, saw Vega burn and Procyon fall. And for the first time in generations, the oppressor bled. Whispers grew in the dark. If humanity could rise from extinction and cripple fleets, then no empire was beyond reach. Insurrections ignited across border sectors, Dominion supply lines collapsing under raids, outposts abandoned in panic. Rin watched the intercepted signals stream across the comm station. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of inevitability. They will call us predators. They will fear corridors that go dark when our ships drift there. That fear is our sovereignty. Hadrian shifted his weight, his body groaning with age and injury. And what of us, Commander? We've bled ships and suns. What do we hold after this war? Rin looked down at the tags sewn inside his coat, cold metal pressing into his chest. His answer was simple, each word driven by the memory of Earth burning. We hold the truth. That extinction was their lie. We endure. Therefore, the galaxy changes. The bridge fell quiet. Smoke curled upward from shattered consoles, the taste of burnt plastic still lingering on their tongues, the distant cries of the wounded echoing through the corridors. Yet through that ruin, every survivor felt the same charge. Silence had been weaponized. Fire had been delivered. Humanity's name, erased from Dominion records, was carved again into history with scars no empire could deny. Rin turned toward the viewport, his reflection blurred against the glowing wreckage of the command vessel. He spoke not to the crew, but to the dead carried within his coat. We were ashes when they last spoke of us. Now we are the shadow behind every corridor they fear to enter. This ledger is complete. The Crown drifted slowly through the wreckage, her hull blackened, her decks scarred, but her heart unbroken. Around her, escorts limped back into formation, battered yet alive. The silence that followed was not exile, it was triumph. The Dominion had learned that the grave they dug for humanity had become a forge. Centuries from now, scholars would argue over tactics, analysts would trace doctrines, and politicians would debate alliances. But in this moment, on the broken bridge of a scarred dreadnought, the truth was simple. Humanity had returned, and the galaxy would never again mistake their silence for death. If this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button. Now we want to hear from you. If you were commanding the Black Fleet, which empire's pride would you shatter first to make the galaxy tremble? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. Thanks for watching Stellar HFY, where strategy wins wars before they're ever fought. See you in the next story.